So thank you very much, Bob. I was debating between which of the two sort of anecdotes I was going to start with, and one anecdote was Dallas saying, "Take a chance on this guy," to Bob. So I thought there's a nice sort of closing of the circle here. What I think Bob didn't mention was that I also came in as a qualifying student. So if I didn't get my grades that quarter, I would have been out of here. Except for most of that 6 years, SFU gave me money. I didn't even have to teach. So when I was thinking about this talk, partly I selected this topic because I thought it is good material for a good, solid Dallas Smythe style argument with you people, because you people are all tree-hugging, Seattle, WTO bashing types, and we in the developing countries are not necessarily sympathetic with this view. So I thought I should have a nice little argument with you. But actually, the origins of this idea came from a very good friend of mine who was at that point in sociology at UBC, Rolf Brillhardt. And I can remember Rolf wanted to put together a panel on trade issues back in 1985, 84, thereabouts, before the WTO, before any of these things really hit the big time. And his sort of sense was, he said, you know, some of these arguments don't seem to make a lot of sense for developing countries. So why don't you come and speak about the developing countries? I was sensible enough to say at that point, I said, no, I don't think I'm quite ready. I was actually in the middle of writing my PhD. But in addition, I said, I don't think I'm quite ready to take that argument on quite yet. So I didn't go on that panel. And I found that over time, I suddenly became an expert in trade. And I actually got into trade negotiations. Not just writing about it, but actually participating in it. So I thought, well, this is about as good a time to reflect on that whole process, which I think you will notice as I go through is not a simple issue, because you are dealing with issues like national sovereignty, national identity, and so on. And one has to always ask, you know, what am I doing to my country? As you sit in these rooms and you negotiate on various points. So, well, 20 years later, I'm answering Rolf's question in some fashion, I suppose. One of the most distinguishing features of studying communication here was, and particularly with Dallas, was that it seemed for most of the time, for many people, like we were studying everything. It wasn't about communication narrowly understood, as in many journalism schools, etc., in the United States. It wasn't about everything either, one hopes. But it was through many things. It was about many things, but through the lens of communication. So I would argue that at that point, there was a great interest in the nation state in many of the people who were working around the Department of Communication at that time. And of course, in Dallas's work, this was quite a central concern. His book, which many of us, I mean, the book has got many aspects that one could look at. To use old Marxist terms, you could say it had many moments. But one that many of us have emphasized, for example, in conversations with Bill Levant and many others, is the audience commodity. But it is also a huge amount of stuff about the nation state that is in there, about cultural screens, and in particular about the role of Canada in relation to the United States. Now, my relations with Dallas, I think those who knew us knew it was always about difference and debate and argument. I couldn't actually understand why he kept answering my letters and giving very detailed comments to most everything that I wrote, even after I left here. So keeping with that tradition, I thought that when the Fest shift came up, which was late 80s, early 90s, that I would find an argument where the differences were quite strong. And I wrote about the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And true to form, Dallas didn't reprimand me or become annoyed. He wrote me extensive comments on how what those arguments were and how they could be improved and things of that nature. So basically at that point we were looking at US-Canada economic relations. That's what Dallas was looking at in 1981. And then 1993, I sort of go back to it, but now in the context of a free trade agreement. And what I'm planning to do today is, hey, I don't live in Canada or the United States now. I'm right in the middle of negotiations between two countries that I have to inform you in honor of Bill Levant have never been politically one, that have always been politically separate. And are now in the process, I would say, of very close economic integration. So basically, that's sort of the structure of this conversation. Let's see, no need to jump that. So just to give you a little bit of context about where we were at that point, I mean, 1979, 1980, when Dallas was writing his book, was finishing his book. I think it came out in 81, I believe. This was a very interesting time when you look back at it, when I thought about it. This was, the energy policy was coming in, and this is most probably what kept Quebec in, gave the government of Canada enough money to bribe Quebec to stay in the Confederation, and most probably will break up the country in the long run, where the Western Canada will go away from the rest of Canada. Foreign investment review agency was in existence in the North American continent. Wow, you could imagine these things. Now, the PQ, the Parti Québécois, had lost the first Quebec referendum. This was the full flowering of nationalism. Americans actually were hiding in the Canadian embassy in Tehran. And when they came out, that was against Islamic Iranian nationalism. And when they came out, they said, they were asked how it was like staying with Canadians for so long. They said, oh, they are just like us, except that they eat use the left hand on the fork. That was the only distinguishing feature of Canadian culture that these people could observe after staying in the Canadian embassy for a very long time. The new international economic order and the information order were very high on the agenda. I was preoccupied with it. I can even remember Trudeau tried the last best shot in Cancun to try to put this thing together, and it failed. That was in about 83, 84. That was very much a nation-state centered, nationalism-centered. Nation-states are good entities that one can build orders around kind of concept. So that was, that's why I say the full flowering was there. On the other side, the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, talking nationalism, talking about the UN system, talking about the nation-state centered entire political system around the United Nations while trampling it in Afghanistan. China had just, I think, was retreating from Vietnam and licking its wounds after that little incursion. Vietnam was still in Cambodia after having got rid of the genocidal Khmer Rouge. The great hero of the South, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, had invaded Uganda to get rid of Idi Amin. Just this shows that in fact the whole thing was shaky. It was sort of at the peak, and in fact the nation state was being violated left and right. I mean, you get further violations when Iraq walks into Kuwait, for example. That basic fundamental principle of the United Nations Charter and national sovereignty and so on is violated. But you can see in this period there's a huge amount of activity around the nation state. But Dallas was, of course, a great believer in this thing, particularly in the Chinese version of the nation state. And I think you just have to look at my 1982 master's thesis. You could see that I too believed in the nation state. Now, in terms of theory that was around, I was happy to see one of the posters from the Innis Conference of 1978 in the Mallinson room. I wasn't there for that particular event, but the conversation was still dominated by Innis. The T-shirts were on sale in the department office. So Innis was really quite a significant part of the conversation in the department. And Benedict Anderson, whose quote I have just put up, was not. The book hadn't come out. We weren't talking about Benedict Anderson at that point. And of course, Bill Gibson, who I consider to be one of the most famous residents of the Lower Mainland, had not yet talked about the consensual hallucination that later became known as cyberspace. So this is the sort of context within which these conversations began, and what Dallas started talking about, and what I started thinking about at Simon Fraser. Now, this imagined political community, imagined both inherently limited and sovereign. There's some questions, people are raising, particularly recently, have raised some questions about the historical research that he uses to buttress this definition. But still, it is a very much a communication-centered definition of the nation state, and it helps us. At least it helps me when I think about how impoverished refugees from Sri Lanka sitting in Vancouver or Toronto are financing suicide assassination assassins on the other side of the world. Or when I think about Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is supposed to be now one of the, they're just close to getting him. I don't know, I haven't read the papers. Have they got him? Or have they got him and they're going to put him out closer to the election? Whatever. When he talks in that famous first videotape in 1991, when he talks about reclaiming Granada and Andalusia, you can have this incredible sense of the Islamic nation being constructed as including the things that were lost in the Middle Ages pretty much, as including Granada and Andalusia, which is southern Spain. So when you think about that, when you think about sort of the strange things that we are trying to grapple with and understand, I find this definition quite interesting. Of course, the political economy question here is not the imagining per se, but how the imagining gets done. How is it that we get the more or less the same thing being imagined by different people in different spaces and times? How does this hallucination become collective? The answer is media. And then we are in its territory. How is it that Canada came to be? We are talking early Innis, the economic history Innis. How is it that Canada came to be? The short answer is canoes and waterways, which is how Canada came to be. But the waterways and the canoes just didn't take the voyagers. They took beaver pelts, they took the commodities of trade, they took ideas, which caused things to be imagined in Athabasca and more or less the same in the Saguenay, and not those same ideas down the Mississippi. So that's sort of the argument for saying this is Canada and that is America. So the necessary condition for a nation state, one would argue, is communication media, including transportation systems. I'll come back to this, because what we are in the middle of today is a complete reconfiguration of the way these transportation and communication systems are being designed. I just read in the papers just 2-3 days ago, I think in one of the Canadian newspapers, that one of the difficulties that CN had Canadian National had was the whole idea that it had to now orient itself on a north-south basis, when in fact it had all been going east-west. So even those things are included in this. So that's a necessary condition. And what is a sufficient condition is, of course, people who want to share the same hallucination. And you can blast all the radio programs you want at the Quebecois, but if they don't want to listen, if they want to imagine other things, well, too bad for Canada. Or you can show them all the logos you want, right? And they'll still separate.